me share a few words of introductions before having our panelists speaking. Oops, I can hear myself in echo. I think that's fine. So we are in the middle of an unprecedented crisis, and it's one part the pandemic and one part the economic crisis. Okay, sorry, sound problem. Okay. And so one part, as I was saying, is the cumulative impact of converging climate and social crises manufactured over decades by corporate and political elites. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has made the stakes really clearer. So I'm taking it as a chance to thank everyone joining this webinar for their willingness to fight for a safe world where justice can thrive. So I'm gonna introduce the objectives of the webinar. So we hope that you will understand why finance is so important to tackling the climate crisis and why the Finance in Common Summit in November is a crucial moment. We hope that you will understand how the stakes for what the stakes are for real global just recovery and the importance of the debt issues. And we will explore ideas and examples of taking action to end fossil finance. I just want to remember people that we encourage them to tweet during the webinar, and you can use the hashtag people not polluters or the hashtag finance in common 2020. This is the official one so that we can make ourselves heard during the webinar too. So first of all, we know that we don't want to go back. What all this means is that we can't go back to what normal looked like before the crisis. If we think a few steps ahead, we can play a powerful force of organizing that can move us towards a just recovery we need. And currently, governments are spending billions on bailouts and stimulus, and the time of unprecedented structural change has come. So they can decide to return to the profit-driven mistakes from the past and reinforce the systems and institutions which caused the multiple crises of today, or they can spend these billions to protect clean air and water, protect the people, build the modern cities needed by millions, and create decent jobs and develop health and education systems fit for the 21st century. We know also that we'll be most successful if we take action when the decisions are being made, not when they've been carried out. And we know that wealthy corporate interests are pushing politicians to cut social services, lift environmental regulations, and relax labor laws to help the economy bounce back. So the problem is, if we want to rebuild this world, we need to stop institutions, so governments and financial institutions, because they keep funding rogue companies whose continued mode of operation requires planetary destruction. So early analysis of recovery finance deployed to date suggests that the trend of public finance propping up to the fossil fuel industry is actually continuing, as fossil fuel intensive industries are receiving a really outsized proportion of recovery finance. And I believe Laurie from All Change International will explore that more. So one of the questions is, how do we spur much further, much faster and more decisive action from institutions that wish to go slowly or perhaps don't wish to act at all? But we're also conscious that climate change is not a technological problem, it's a social and political challenge. And that's why we need you, and we're building all together a strong people-powered movement that is eroding support for the fossil fuel industry, for the polluters, one step at a time. So I'm quickly gonna introduce the Finance in Common Summit, which is why we also invited you to this webinar, because it's really a big thing. For the first time in history, 450 public finance institutions, so it includes multilateral development banks, regional and national development banks, export credit agencies, are gonna be all together in Paris in November. So from the 10th to the 12th of November. Their objective is to adopt declarations to respond to the COVID crisis, as well as with aligning their activities with the Paris Agreement and the sustainable development and biodiversity goals. So we want to make sure that those institutions move much faster, and our joint demands, because there are a lot of civil society organizations working around the summits, will be for them to increase support towards resilience building projects, but also tackling the sovereign debt crisis and putting an end to fossil fuel finance and supporting a just transition. Really, one message that we have is that all this public money must support people and the planet. So I'm really happy now to invite Laurie from All Change International to tell us more about the problem of fossil fuel finance in regards to social justice and climate justice.
Thanks so much, Clémence. And I'm also going to share my screen because I have some slides prepared for this as well. Can you see my slides now? Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Laurie van den Burg and I work as a senior campaigner with Oil Change International. Oil Change International is a NGO that is data-driven and people-powered, and that focuses on exposing the true cost of fossil fuels to facilitate the transition to clean energy and a just and fairer world. And today I'm going to talk about how we can make sure that the Finance in Common Summit delivers on ending fossil fuel finance and increasing just transition support for workers and communities affected. And I'm first going to go through the science that is behind this call for an end to fossil fuel finance. And then I'm going to talk you through the current trends that we're seeing. And unfortunately, we're seeing that governments and public finance institutions are continuing to prop up fossil fuels. Then I'm going to take you through the basic arguments why oil, gas, and coal are the wrong bet for a just recovery from COVID-19. And then I'll end with how we can make sure to get a joint announcement at the Finance in Common Summit around ending fossil fuel finance. And also, I hope that I will make you very enthusiastic for this opportunity to get this joint announcement at the Finance in Common Summit. And I hope to draw many of you into the work that needs to be done to get there. So on this slide, I have a graph that OCI first developed back in 2016, and my colleague Kelly Trout recently updated the figures with the latest data from the IPCC and also Rystad Energy. And this figure shows that the emissions in the reserves, the coal, gas and oil reserves that are currently in operation, already far exceeds the emissions that we can still release if we want to stay within the 2-degree carbon budget or the 1.5-degree carbon budget. So this basically tells us that if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, we cannot further expand fossil fuel infrastructure, and we should certainly not invest our public money into expanding fossil fuel infrastructure. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that governments and public finance institutions are continuing to prop up fossil fuels. So on the left side of this slide, I have a graph from the UNEP production gap report that was published in November last year that shows that governments around the world are still planning to produce 120% more fossil fuels than compatible with the 1.5 degree limit. And on the right side of this slide, I have a graph from a report that OCI published in June this year that shows that the public finance institutions of the G20 governments are still providing 3 times as much public finance for fossil fuels as for clean energy. And that is $77 billion a year that they're putting into fossil fuel projects. And together with a group of think tanks and research organizations and NGOs, we're also involved in a project in which we are tracking recovery money to energy projects. And unfortunately, and Clemence also already mentioned this in her introduction, we're currently seeing that most of the recovery money is flowing to fossil fuels as opposed to clean energy. And that is, of course, problematic for many reasons. I'm sure that most of you on the call today understand very well that fossil fuels are the wrong bet for a just recovery from COVID-19. We know that fossil fuels were already showing signs of permanent decline before COVID-19 hit. We also know that investments in renewable energy generate more jobs than investments in fossil fuels. And even if public finance institutions often argue that they need to invest in fossil fuels to support development, we know that the largest recipients of support, public finance support for fossil fuels, are not the poorest countries. And where finance does flow to lower income countries, that money typically benefits multinational corporations and wealthy donor countries over local populations, whilst often also causing human and indigenous rights violations and degrading health and the environment. What we've also seen with the way that COVID-19 has hit the oil and gas sector is that reliance on this very volatile commodity for government revenue is very risky. So we've seen that rich producing countries like the United States, Canada, and Norway have been bailing out their fossil fuel industries, and the low-income producing countries like Venezuela and Nigeria didn't really have that option, and they've faced massive budget crunches because a lot of their government revenue currently comes from oil and gas. So this all shows that a continued reliance on this volatile commodity is not in the interest of developing countries. So it's really crucial that we use this moment to turn the tide. And to do that, we also need public finance institutions to get behind a managed decline of fossil fuels with just transition support for workers and communities, as opposed to economic chaos and climate chaos. Unfortunately, we're seeing some steps that are being taken by public finance institutions in the right direction. So in November last year, we had an announcement from the European Investment Bank that they would end all their fossil fuel financing by the end of 2021. And we're currently awaiting an announcement from the UK government around ending overseas fossil fuel finance. And the Financing Commons Summit provides the perfect opportunity to leverage the leadership that we're seeing at some of these institutions and make sure that other institutions follow suit with similar commitments to end fossil fuel financing. And this is why a working group of NGOs has been pushing for this summit to deliver on ending fossil fuel finance through a joint commitment focused on this topic. And we think that for this initiative to come to fruition, it really needs the support from the European Investment Bank, which is leading on a high-level event focused on climate change at the summit, AFD, which is the main organizer of the summit, the COP26 finance team, and also the UK government and the UNSG. And we have also identified potential candidates for this joint commitment focused on ending fossil fuel finance. But we are definitely looking to expand this list of possible candidates for this initiative, and would very much value your input on whether there are any institutions in your countries that are in a position to join this announcement. Then in addition to that, of course, we also want to make use of this event to raise pressure on the laggards and to expose those institutions that are still providing massive amounts of financing for fossil fuels and that are not yet prepared to move away from that. And therefore, we're working together to build public campaigns to expose those laggards. And on this slide, I have included a sign-up sheet for a number of working groups that we're establishing, in which we want to take forward that public campaign preparation and also the advocacy and policy coordination that we need to do in the lead up to the summit, so that we can make sure that we're coordinated and that we are effective in all of the work that we're doing in the lead up to this summit. So I'd be happy to share that sign-up sheet with you also in the chat after my presentation. So this joint commitment that I've focused on ending fossil fuel finance that I've been talking about, we think that really needs to set a gold standard for other institutions to follow. And for it to set a gold standard, it needs to be very ambitious. So it needs to be ambitious not just on oil, but also on gas. It needs to be ambitious in terms of timeline. So we think that it needs to focus on ending fossil fuel investments, all new fossil fuel investments immediately, and then a phase out of existing investments by COP26, the end of 2021. And then in addition, we think that these leading public finance institutions should present a detailed roadmap for full Paris alignment by COP26. And that roadmap should be based on credible and robust scenarios that do not rely on negative emission technologies. And there are some more ingredients listed on this slide that we think should be part of this commitment. And we've also included more details on each of these in a briefing that we've written on this topic that is also linked on this slide. And then on this slide, I have a number of resources, some op-eds that have been written on this topic, the report that I mentioned that maps G20 public finance for energy, and the briefing that I already mentioned. And I'd like to close off by saying that I think there is a real opportunity to get this joint commitment around ending fossil fuel finance at the Financing Commons Summit. We have some buy-in from EIB and AFD, and the UNSG team for this at the moment, but we do really need your support to make sure that we get this commitment. And therefore, I'd very much like to invite you to sign up to one of the working groups that we're establishing so that we can coordinate our work in the lead up to the summit. And yeah, I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that we can get some results at this summit, and some of those results that we really urgently need to see. So thanks so much for your attention. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Laurie. And so it's really clear, it's been clear for a long time that we need to keep fossil fuel on the ground, but it's great also to make people understand how those financial flows, for instance, from the north will have dramatic impact in other places in the world, and we'll hear about a specific case. So a huge infrastructure project in Mozambique, and Ilham is going to talk about it. Friends of Dearest Mozambique, Justicia Ambiental is leading the fight against the project, and happy to hear you, Ilham.
Thanks, Clemence. Sorry about the sun. I hope it's not annoying. Rachel from Friends of the Earth, England, Wales, Northern Ireland is going to be speaking on this as well, about the litigation that they just launched against the UK Export Credit Agency for Mozambique gas. So it's, you know, Mozambique gas issue is just, it's a perfect example of what Laurie was talking about. So how when wealthy countries, in wealthy states invest in sort of poorer countries, the benefit never actually goes down to the people, because they would not have to continue this rhetoric about, you know, how they have to invest in fossil fuels to benefit the people, because if this was actually happening, people wouldn't still be so poor after all these years of fossil fuels. And what happens is that when there is income and revenue from the fossil fuels in Mozambique, as in most of Africa, it goes to the elites. So the issue with the Mozambique gas project is the gas is actually going to be extracted offshore. And the big companies that are involved are Total, Eni, ExxonMobil, Gulp, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, and many of the financiers are state. So it is the UKEF, UK Export Finance, agreed to do this, the UK Export Import Bank, the US Export Import Bank, US Development Finance, and the Portuguese Export Credit Agency, SACE, the Italians, and many state agencies, as well as many state export-import banks. So the most recent one that has agreed to finance is the South African Export Credit Agency, which is the Export Credit Insurance Corporation. And one of the reasons it's really important to stop this financing is the gas industry is doing in Mozambique what it's a textbook example of the extractive industry in Africa and in the global south. It's mass relocations of people, which means that they're losing their homes and their livelihoods. The compensation process that Total boasts about is actually, it's either inadequate or just not at all. And we're speaking about an area that is already, it's a poor area. And this poverty and the unemployment is not something that's new. It's something that has been there for a long time because of the issue of elites being the ones with money. And, the government has continued this practice of keeping money with the elites. So what you've got here is when states like the UK and the US and now South Africa invest in industry that is violating human rights, that is destroying the climate, all of which has been in the this company's environmental impact assessment. None of this is new. When that happens, it's not just that states are investing in fossil fuels, it's that they're also investing in a system and hence enabling a system of corruption. They're rewarding a system that keeps communities poor and keeps them reliant on fossil fuels, even though, or keeps a company, a government, not just reliant on fossil fuels, but reliant on the whole system of financing of that fossil fuels. So Mozambique it's corrupt, okay? And yes, you have, when you speak to financiers, private or public, about investing in a corrupt country and hence in further exacerbating this corruption, the response is often, unashamedly, but Africa is corrupt. Here we've got a situation where there was a massive illegal debt scandal in 2017 that involved a mercenary king, Eric Prince, that involved Credit Suisse, VTB Bank. And it's been proven in international courts. There are 2 Credit Suisse bankers in jail. There were 140 people charged with electoral fraud, actually found guilty of electoral fraud by the Mozambican highest court after the last election. So we're dealing with a officially found corrupt government. So the thing is, these countries then, which are, so the US, even South Africa now, which talks about Paris and greening the economy, they actually don't have a leg to stand on when they call anybody out for corruption, because corruption is a two-way thing, right? You can't have a Mozambican government that is corrupt if there isn't somebody else corrupting it. And it's, the African governments, including Mozambique, are to an extent held hostage to this foreign direct investment that goes back to colonialism. You know, in South Africa, it goes back to apartheid. We still have debts from apartheid. So this is what's continuing to enable this reliance on fossil fuels and this reliance of money going to the elite. And so it's important to know, like, one of the big things that have come out now because of that we hear about in the news a lot more than we hear about the actual, violations on the ground that people are suffering from, is this militarization and these attacks. That is a really convenient way as well for the media, for the government, for companies to take away from the fact that that these problems have been there for a long time. So if you've got insurgents coming into an area where young people have been promised jobs by Total and by contractors in this gas industry, but they're very frustrated because the only jobs that people have actually been given are as cooks and cleaners and menial jobs. There's a lot of anger. It's a breeding ground for extremism of sorts. It's a way that people are showing their anger because they have nothing and they've received nothing. And this has been going on for a long time. So, so this is one of the biggest problems with public financing of the gas industry in Mozambique. It's not just the fossil fuels, it's the human rights, but it's also continuing a government culture of corruption, the government culture that will, no matter how much foreign direct investment comes into the country, the country will always need more. So I just want to mention about the Export Credit Insurance Corporation of South Africa. This is a new thing that's being looked at because this is the first time the first time that we learned that the ECIC was actually involved in this was through a Reuters article 2 years ago. And most people that I've spoken to, even economists and finance professionals, have never heard of the ECIC. Like, we'd never heard about it. And it's a state agency that's using public money to fund these things. So when we wrote an article about it, we wrote an op-ed, and this was really the first time that so many people have heard about it. And they've been working in the dark. And when we initially contacted them, what the US export EXIM does, for example, and it's not necessarily working, but is that they'll put up the project that they're considering financing so that technically people can submit comments or give input, whereas in South Africa, we don't put that information up because we're not signatory to the OECD guidelines. So you'll only find out what project the government has decided to finance once they've actually decided to finance it. So the way that important ways that we think we can take action against this, especially considering that we're dealing with, as JA, we're dealing with we're working very closely with partners like Friends of the Earth, Uni, who are taking their own governments to court. We also are now dealing with the ECIC, who has never been dealt with before. So this is research that we're doing from scratch. And the things that we feel we can use in this particular situation that has been different with private banks and companies, the activism we've done against them, is to get taxpayer publicity for taxpayers around this. Perhaps if South Africans knew that what their tax money was going to, they would be a lot more interested. Also, this is a way you can ask parliamentary questions is through this. You can raise the issue through parliamentary questions, perhaps through judicial review, the media, and also there's the potential for litigation as well. So I think from there, I'm gonna just hand over to Rachel, who can talk about the litigation that they've just started against the UK government, because it's really amazing.
Thank you, and thank you, Clemence, for making space for me today as well to speak. So yeah, my name's Rachel. I work for Friends of the Earth England, Wales and Northern Ireland, based in England, in London. And since the start of the year, we've been investigating how our government, the UK government, kind of invests overseas with public finance and trying to move that out of oil and gas and into kind of more sustainable more climate friendly, more environmentally friendly projects. So UK taxpayers have basically been unknowingly funding a lot of really dirty oil and gas projects in the global south for years through a variety of different companies and agencies and departments. Between 2010 and 2017, the UK provided support for energy in developing countries in the global south to just under £8 billion, 60% of which was in fossil fuels. And between same period, so between 2010 and 2017, an estimated 96% of our UK export finance funding went to fossil fuel developments, mainly oil and gas, but some coal in there as well, just for to keep that going. And particularly, we've been looking at the latest decision they've made with UK export finance funding, which was for the Mozambique LNG project that Ilham has mentioned. I do want to mention some of the context around this, though, that other people have mentioned as well. Mozambique is one of the world's poorest countries. The UK is one of the world's wealthiest countries. The UK has this huge historic responsibility for climate change. I think it's the fifth highest historic responsibility worldwide. And the people of Mozambique are right on the the front lines of climate change. The UK is also really lagging behind redressing that balance and doing its fair share of climate action. We recently did, with some other partners, a piece of research about what the UK's fair share of climate action would be internationally. And it turns out not only do we have to get our emissions to zero as soon as possible, yesterday preferably, we also have to do that same amount of effort internationally as well, reducing that same amount of emissions again. So it's completely, obviously, awful that we're pumping billions into making climate change worse internationally. And as Ilham's mentioned, there's a lot of colonial overtones to this, that we're still extracting resources and gas and money from other countries. So that's a bit of context which I think is quite important. But specifically, we've been looking at UK export finance, which is a department of our government that provides loans and guarantees to ensure that projects that would benefit the UK don't fail through lack of finance or insurance. So it's all about propping up the UK economy, basically. Last year, it invested 762 million in oil and gas, compared to about 400 million in renewables. And actually, the UK Parliament did an investigation into how we were spending our export finance a couple of years ago, and it found, its conclusion was that most of UKEF support to UK businesses undermines the UK's climate commitments. So we're actively undermining any work we've been doing on climate change as well. And the sort of things we have supported are the Mozambique LNG project, offshore oil and gas in Ghana, expansions of oil refineries in Kuwait, offshore oil platforms in Brazil. There's a whole host of things in there. Obviously, the climate impact of these is huge. The BBC did some investigations that suggested the combined emissions from UK-funded projects would be about 69 million tonnes of carbon per year. That's about the same as Portugal's emissions. So that's a whole other country's worth of emissions that we're funding outside of our borders. So Ilham's told you about the Mozambique LNG project. I won't repeat any of the horrendous consequences of that project here, but what we found out in July through some legal proceedings that we were investigating is that the UK government decided to invest $1 billion worth of UK export finance into that project. And we don't think this is right, obviously. We think in funding this project with its climate impacts, with its environmental damage, with its human rights abuses, we think UK export finance and other departments in the government are in breach of international standards on the environment and human rights, and have really failed to properly consider the Paris Agreement and climate change. So I'll just tell you briefly about our grounds. They're very top line. So we think we're not following international best practice. We think the transparency and disclosure has been incredibly poor, so they haven't been open with the British public about this process, and we think they've not considered climate change, the Paris Agreement, and other issues around the environment. So we filed a case last week. It's very exciting. If we win, the government's decision will hopefully be declared unlawful, and they will have to go back and retake that decision. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean the conclusion they reached will be challenged, but they have to redo the process. So they could decide the same thing again, but hopefully not. Hopefully they would come to a different decision, particularly, as Laurie mentioned as well, the government are actually should be announcing next week this decision that they're going to phase out support for financing fossil fuels. So we hope the combination of the legal case and this policy review the government's doing will combine, that we can hopefully overturn the UK support for Mozambique LNG. I will leave it there. Thank you very much. And happy to answer questions later.
Thanks a lot, Rachel and Ilham. So I've also posted in the chat how all the different credit export agencies that have supported this project. So you have France, South Africa, UK, Japan, Italy, US, China, Thailand, Netherlands. And so we'll talk about ways to get involved. And as Rachel underlined, those finance are not compatible with a lot of international commitments. And so even though those finance have already been given to the project, it's not too late to make it an international shame. So I hope this will encourage you ahead of the Finance in Common Summit to really put pressure on those export credit agencies that are maybe in your countries and that I'm sure are financing far more dirty projects than this one around the world. So now I'm gonna pass on to Lydie, who's gonna talk about the need for a real global just transition and how we can make sure that the sovereign debt issue is present and visible as well during the Finance in Common Summit. So please, Lydie, we're happy to hear you.
Hello, everyone. I'm turning on my video for a few seconds there so that you can see me, but I have to turn it off so you can hear me well. So I'm turning it off and sharing my screen. Okay, can you see it? I hope you can see the screen.
We can.
Okay, thank you. So I'm trying to do the presentation mode. Okay, so I've been asked to give a presentation on the problem of the debt because it is a very, very important problem that we also raise, as we campaign in the lead up to the Finance in Common Summit. And I also would like to say that we are very much part of the campaign also to end financing of fossil fuels. And in fact, a lot of the financing of fossil fuels comes in the form of loans. So the debt and the issue of financing of fossil fuels is a very, very tied or very much linked issue or problem. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought sharp focus on the problem of huge debts of Southern governments, a problem that has plagued most countries in the South for many decades. In the Philippines, we have been campaigning against the debt since the 1980s, since the first global debt crisis that took place in that decade. We cannot pursue a just economic rebuilding or a just economic recovery or a Green New Deal, as you call it in Europe and the US, without addressing the debt problem. And it's very important to understand the history and roots of the debt problem in order to pursue fair and just solutions. But we don't have time to go into the history right now. It's just important to point out that the problem is not simply about Southern governments' propensity for borrowing and accumulating debt. It is important to understand it as a problem resulting in large part from a legacy of colonization for many countries, supply-driven lending by creditors, and one of the key drivers for promoting fossil fuels in the South, unjust economic relations across countries that keep our countries in the South impoverished, including financial relations and transactions such as in lending and borrowing. What is the most obvious and popularly understood dimension of the debt problem is that debt payments have taken a huge share of public resources and have been prioritized by governments over health, education, housing, and other services. But the impact of policy conditionalities accompanying loans, so when you borrow, they impose conditionalities on your loans, has been and is as harmful, if not more so, than debt service itself. Debt service is the term when you say debt payments. And these conditionalities have included tight austerity measures involving fiscal and monetary policies, privatization of essential services, trade liberalization, currency and capital accounts liberalization, to mention just a few. We in the South have also pointed out for many years that there is also the problem of illegitimate debt. These are debts that have been contracted in our name and are being paid with our money, public funds. But we refuse to see these as debts, our debts, the debts of the people of the South, because one, these illegitimate debts have not at all benefited the people and have in fact been used to finance harmful projects such as fossil fuel projects. These are debts which have violated democratic processes and laws. These are debts actually of private corporations, but assumed as public liabilities. And these are debts which have come with highly onerous and unfair terms. So not all illegitimate debts exhibit all 1 to 4, but most of them have exhibited 1 or 2 of these features. All of these are part of the major reasons why debt is contributing to deepening inequality and injustice in the South and in the world, and why we are saddled with underfinanced and highly inadequate health systems and essential services, realities that have made the COVID-19 pandemic and the accompanying economic crisis, and added to that, the climate crisis, even more devastating. The multiple crises we face, COVID-19, economic crisis, climate crisis, today offers opportunities for us to renew our efforts in calling for solutions, those which offer immediate relief, but also those which will have more lasting impacts and will address the roots of the problem. The COVID-19 has led to debt relief initiatives from lenders or creditors, so debt relief is now on the table and being discussed. Unfortunately, these offers are similar to major debt relief initiatives of creditors in the last 2 decades of HIPIC, Highly Enhanced Poor Country Debt Relief Initiative. Then they followed it with Enhanced HIPIC, and then the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative adopted in 2005 at the Gleneagles Summit in the UK. These debt relief has involved too few countries, too little amounts, and very little actual relief, and an overriding concern to make sure creditors are paid above all. So for this year, under COVID-19, we have 2 debt relief offers. The IMF announced its debt relief initiative in April 2020 with 500 million to be provided through its Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. So what is this 500 million about? It will pay the creditors for 6 months, creditors of 29 countries, for the debt that they are supposed to pay, the debt payments they are supposed to pay for 6 months in 2020. So this is not actually a debt cancellation. This is just IMF stepping in to pay the debts of these 29 countries for 6 months, the debt payments for 6 months. The G20, on the other hand, announced within the same month the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which involves simply a delay of debt payments due from May 1, 2020 to December 31, 2020. So it's not even a cancellation. It's just, you delay your debt payments. You don't pay it for, 7 months, 8 months, but you start paying again after this period. And countries eligible to apply only include those in the list of the World Bank's IDA, and the United Nations list of least developed countries, a total of 76 countries. So the IMF is 29 countries, and G20, 76 countries, which overlap each other. So it's actually a total of just 76 countries. And the amount of debt service to be suspended is just about 11 billion. So remember the figures, it's $11.5 billion of so-called debt relief. But here is what the reality is. I'm not going to take you through all these figures. Just look at the lower right-hand corner. That is the total debt of all low and middle income countries in all of the regions of the world, including Europe. And that is 1,104,237,800,000. That is the total debt stock that is outstanding today. They're going to have a relief of 11.5 billion of debt service or debt payments. 500 million canceled, 11 billion delayed, but the total annual debt payments of all of the low and middle income countries amounts to 371 billion 964 million, or let's just say 372 billion. So what is being offered today, if it is in fact debt relief, is very little amounts for too few countries. But the important thing is that they are discussing it. So this is an opportunity for us again to raise the call for debt cancellation and addressing the problem of the debt more systemically and addressing the roots. So we have some demands, and I'm just mentioning the first, 4 major ones. Deeper, wider public debt cancellation for all vulnerable countries, not just the 76. Low and middle income is more than 100 countries. By all lenders and creditors, official and private, because we just mentioned that what is being offered is just about the official debt. Beginning with a minimum of debt payments cancellation for at least 4 years without penalties, and the savings to be spent for appropriate measures to the multiple crises, the health pandemic, the economic crisis, and climate change. We also are saying no to loans as a form of COVID-19 fiscal response measures, because that's what they're doing. They're offering more loans than debt cancellation. Just as we are saying no loans for climate finance, we're saying no loans for COVID-19 fiscal response measures. We're also calling on the UN to start immediately a process and mechanism for comprehensively addressing not just unsustainable debt or debts that are difficult to pay, but illegitimate debts, debts we should not pay in the first place, and for comprehensive debt audits by lenders and borrowers. And finally, the adoption of international and national rules for fair, just, and democratic lending and borrowing processes and contracts. And I'd just like to add, just to link this presentation to Laurie and to what has been presented by our Friends of the Earth colleagues, Rachel and Ilham, that we consider debts to fossil fuel projects as illegitimate debts because they are harmful and they have severe negative consequences, not just for the people and communities, but for the entire planet. And so I'd like to end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Lydie, for these presentations. And again, thank you for everyone on this webinar coming from all around the world. It's really impressive. So I'm gonna move to the final part of this webinar, and that's how you can get involved. I also want to apologize for if my strong accent makes it more difficult to understand, and I know that everyone watching the webinar doesn't have English as their first language, so thank you for this additional effort we are all making to work all together. So let me share my screen again. So how can I get involved? That's the question. And so I think it comes back to our theory of change and how we think we can move on powerful institutions or companies. So some of you may be part already of an NGO, an association, some of you may be part of grassroots network or not involved into a group. So it's going to be broad, but until November, we're going to share new opportunities to dig this subject a bit further. So what you can see here is the traditional view of power on the left, and on the right, so the other visions is that there are pillars of support of this power, and that if we break those pillars of support, then the incumbent system can shift and can fall. And so that's what we're trying to do. And so to get back to the fossil finance problem, so you may wonder, so where does a fossil fuel company get money from? So indeed, they're getting it from government subsidies, people buy the product, banks and other businesses loan them money, courts and society don't charge them for the harm they're doing, and schools, cities, pensions, and other stakeholders invest in shares of their stock. And the other question is, how do we stop this? So we can change political power, divest, we can change laws and make them pay, we can reduce our consumptions. And here specifically, we're going to talk more around fossil fuel finance campaigning, but you've heard also from Rachel how linking tactics is extremely powerful. So on this fossil finance pyramid, again, you have all those money, and we're going to focus on the public banks, because that's those who are and finance ministers, because they're going to be present at the Finance in Common Summit. And so what levers do we have for this summit? So we can put pressure by every means on the hosts of the summit. So the French Credit Export, the French Development Agency, the French government, Emmanuel Macron, those are convening the summit, and on the public financial institutions participating to the summit. So it can be done internationally with coalition efforts, because a lot of civil society organizations are already working on advocacy and making sure that demands are being heard. Or it can be also your national targets. So I can't list all the 450 multilateral banks in the world, but I'm sure you can research which one is in your country. And so we can also support allies to raise expectation on the summit's outcome. And so this is why it's really important that we use different tactics to make our demands being heard, and because in many cases, all those institutions have not been targeted by civil society organization as such. So it will be a bit the vampire strategy. So as long as they are in the shadow, in the dark, they can do whatever they want. But if we expose them and put the spotlight on them, then it's going to be more difficult for them to find their ways out on keeping financing useless and destructive forces. So this image summarizes pretty well what we're trying to do. So I'm going to talk quickly about one case study, which is the European Investment Bank, on which lots of organizations and grassroots groups around the world have fight on. So it's going to be really short. Of course, there are lots to tell about this campaign, but I'm going to share only a few tactics with you that we've used and that can be of inspiration if you want to target your national bank. So the EIB is one of the biggest multilateral bank and was also big lenders to fossil fuel companies. And so, of course, we've started with a public petition. So sometimes people get bored by petitions, but it's actually a great way first of all, to make sure that we are aligned on demands and that our target can not ignore that. You can also build your base of supporters with a petition, and also, most importantly, you can deliver this petition to the directors. And so that's what we did afterwards during this EIB campaign. What's important as well is really to train people, because maybe if you're here or you were interested in the subject or you want to get involved, but it's important that more and more people align on the different on strategies so that we can really have an impact. And so it's really important for you to share the knowledge you have or the knowledge you can get and discuss about it with different organizations or different grassroots groups or people around you. One small-scale actions that we did was to make people write postcards to be sent to their finance ministers. So it's really easy actions to do, at least in like many parts of the world, and if there are many of them, you can't ignore it. But also, it's quite entertaining as a way to communicate to other people goals around the campaigns. So we also did protests outside the EIB's headquarters and actions at finance ministries. And as I was saying, those targets are particularly sensitive to creative actions because usually they're not targeted. So of course, if you invite journalists, it's even better. And they are often looking for images because when we discuss about those topics, it can be quite dry, but you can make it a bit more entertaining. Also, of course, we all know that we're in a very difficult context with COVID-19. So in some parts of the world, it's not even possible to gather at all. In some other parts, you will be able to gather like 10, 12 people. But, you know, for a while, the climate movement has been working on mass mobilizations, but that doesn't mean that really low-scale creative actions can't have an impact. And yes, so the surprise was that at one of action we did, the vice president of the IB came and he didn't agree to our demands, but they shared afterwards that they really felt pressured knowing that all the different countries were watching at them. And so we haven't won everything on the EIB. And so as Lydia has shared, it's quite difficult to have all our demands being met by such complex and big institutions because they hold so much power that you know, there is the fossil finance problem and also the debt problem. So for instance, in that case, the EIB gave a huge loan to a huge pipeline arriving in Italy, and so they didn't remove the loan, but at least they agreed to end fossil fuel lending by the end of 2020. And so this is why now for this Finance in Common Summit, there are institutions that have made progress and that we can count on to be at the top of the pyramid and trying to leverage more leadership and accountability from other financial institutions. I just want to let Ahmed, my colleague from the South Africa team, share one example from a campaign they were leading as well.
Cool, thanks Clémence, and hi everyone. So Clémence has just asked me to spend just a few minutes. I've got about 3 minutes to quickly chat about a tactic that we used earlier on this year during COVID-19 lockdown when people couldn't physically go out to put pressure on one of our campaign targets. So at the beginning, so in May, we were trying to engage the Industrial Development Corporation Corporation, which is a public finance institution in South Africa that's also involved in the Mozambique LNG project. And just for context, we'd written to the IDC before we decided to go ahead with this online and phone banking action, and weren't able to get their attention. So we used lockdown and the tools we have online, as well as phones, to try and get their attention. Together with the grassroots partners and broader networks, we organized this online and phone banking action targeting the IDC, which has a mandate to promote sustainable economic development and poverty reduction. However, they're not living up to this mandate due to their heavy exposure to the country's coal sector, as well as their involvement in the Mozambique LNG project, which Ilham and Rachel presented on. So our broader public finance campaign is calling on public finance institutions, which include the Development Bank of Southern Africa, as well as the Industrial Development Corporation, to come out with a fossil fuel exclusion policy. And through this campaign, we're really trying to highlight the crucial role that public finance institutions can play in achieving climate and social justice. Along with this campaign, we're also targeting the country's Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, who is the political sort of principal or the shareholder of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and therefore, has this sort of power to insist that the institutions come out with fossil fuel exclusion policies. So for this online action, our ask was, or at least what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide people with an easy inroad into taking action from home as a result of COVID-19 lockdown. And our objectives were to disrupt the IDC social media platforms, their email channels, and telephone lines for one day. We wanted to bring attention to principles for a just recovery, our call for a fossil fuel exclusion policy, and also really drive down the message that they need to align their financial flows with the Paris goal of 1.5 to achieve climate and social justice. We also wanted to amplify a report that was conducted by some our partners at the Center for Environmental Rights, which assessed the policies of public finance institutions across 9 thematic areas, including energy and climate change. There were 5 institutions assessed, including the DBSA and the IDC. And the IDC came out last in this analysis, and this is mainly due to the fact that a lot of their policies aren't publicly available. So it was a really good opportunity for us to, push on them, or at least press on them to make those policies publicly available. And this was an opportunity for us to really highlight their poor performance in that report. So just to wrap up, what we were able to do with this phone banking and online action is that we were able to provide participants with a menu of options to get involved and participate in taking action on the IDC. We managed to get hundreds of people to call, to tweet, to email the IDC, as well as also really bring attention to our fossil fuel exclusion policy ask in a way that was quite powerful for our base to connect with the IDC at a time when physical actions weren't possible. And yeah, I'll just sort of leave it at that and turn it back to you, Clémence. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ahmed. Thanks for joining. I always love hearing about your campaigns, and I'm looking forward to strengthen the ties between the different targets and different movements around the world ahead of this summit. Sorry, everyone, we're slightly running late. If you can stay 5 to 7 more minutes, we're gonna wrap up. So I'm gonna share again my screen. And so this is a slide prepared by Ahmed, and it's gonna be shared with you also after the webinar. And so what I wanted to highlight is really the cycle of momentum, because in campaigns and in our movements, changes are not linear. And so you may want to think about your movement, the movement into those three phases. So we need to get active popular support so that our demands are heard and adopted by targets. But then we also want to have more people in our movement so that we can create bigger change. And then there is the escalation phase, and escalation can be heard and understood very, very differently depending on the countries you are, the campaigns you're leading. But it's important to force people to pick their side, whether they support your demands or whether they support the status quo from those corporations, from those institutions, which are leading to the climate chaos and the really disastrous effects that we're seeing now. So I just, as a next step, a really immediate next steps, we have a really great website. It's trainings at 350.org, and we have workshop trainings, meetings, activities. We have meeting facilitation tools. We also have strategy and organizing tools. And I really recommend you to take on this intro to campaigning, because maybe some of you are familiar with climate change, but doesn't really exactly know what does campaigning entails. And so by every mean, we will follow up after this webinar if you want to get more involved into those finance campaign, but just think about all the way you can exert your power and people power and the people's next to you power. And so we still have 5 minutes for questions. So there were lots of questions that have been answered during this webinar already. I'm wondering if we have some.
Yeah, Clemence, I can jump. So one of the questions that repeated a few times, and I wonder, if one of the panelists can answer that, is about the Uganda-Tanzania crude oil pipeline, and what is the situations with this pipeline currently? Is there one of the panelists that can answer that?
Yeah, Yossi, I could maybe quickly provide a quick response on that, but I don't have all the details. But as far as I know, this week, the Ugandan and Tanzanian governments have decided to go ahead with the project. It seems like it has reached a financial close. And just recently today, there were a few activists and journalists that have been pushing back against the project that were detained. So there are some organizers and I guess NGOs across the continent that are really pushing back and decrying the fact that these activists were detained today. But yeah, the latest status on that project is that it seems like the governments are really to push ahead with it.
Thank you, Ahmed. And then there is another question from Sualal. Do you think corporate funding to political parties in election is the biggest problem of our slow progress in achieving climate target? So is there any one of the panelists that want to jump on that question?
I'm happy to jump on that. I think it's definitely also a big issue that we need to tackle, and I think that generally the close ties between governments and the corporates, and in particular also the big oil and gas corporations, is a really big barrier to the energy transition that we need to address if we want to make this transition happen. And in the US, for example, OCI is involved in a campaign where we're getting politicians to sign a declaration that they won't take any money from the fossil fuel industry And that's one way in which we're trying to make sure that there is that politicians can actually be independent and represent the interest of the public rather than the industry. But it's a crucial piece of the puzzle where lots of work also continues to be done and needs to be done.
Thanks again to everyone and to the different panelists, and thanks a lot for your great engagement. So please watch your email. We'll reach out soon. And well, we hope that you're going to join us in asking for and be behind those demands ahead of the Financing Commons Summit. So it's really timely now that we started pressuring them ahead of the summit so that they can't ignore that. I just want to highlight that public finance may not be all. We all know that there are private finance behind also the ECOP pipeline or the Mozambique project, but public finance has actually is a good way to start because with $1 of public money, then the private sector will be incentivized to add 9. So it's also really strategic if we want to change the financial system to start with public money. Thanks again, and so I guess it's time to wrap up.
Sorry, Clémence, can I very, very quickly come in
Sure.
with a final note?
Yes.
I already mentioned this in my presentation, but I just wanted to mention this again, just to be sure. So there is lots of work that we can do in the lead up to the Financing Commons Summit to make the change happen that we want to see. And in that work, it would be really great if we can continue to coordinate amongst ourselves and work together so that we can get the right messaging out there and so that we can get the deliverables that we want to see. And to do that, we are building some working groups where we, among different organizations, can coordinate our activities in the lead up to the Financing Commons Summit. So I will again share the link to the sign-up sheet for those working groups, and I'd love to see many of you in those working groups and look forward to working with you in the lead up to the summit. And thanks so much, Clémence and Josie, for organizing this.
Thanks a lot for everyone's leadership. I wish you a very good day and let's talk soon.
Cheers.